The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as tourists from around the world gathered behind the protective barriers. Among them stood Margaret Whitmore, a woman in her late 40s wearing designer sunglasses and carrying an expensive handbag. She had traveled from America specifically to see the famous royal guards, but not for the reasons most visitors came. Margaret believed that as a paying tourist she deserved special treatment and access that others did not. The royal guards stood motionless at their posts, dressed in their iconic red tunics and bearskin hats. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were fully trained soldiers from elite regiments of the British Army, responsible for protecting the royal residences and the royal family themselves. Each guard had undergone rigorous training and served with distinction. They took their duties seriously, and any threat or disruption to their work was handled with swift precision. Margaret pushed through the crowd, ignoring the polite protests of other tourists. She wanted the perfect photograph, and in her mind nothing should stand in her way. The barriers were clearly marked with signs explaining that visitors must remain behind them at all times. The guards needed clear pathways to perform their duties, and obstructing them could be considered a security risk. But Margaret had convinced herself that these rules applied to everyone except her. A young couple from Japan tried to gently suggest she step back, but Margaret waved them off dismissively. An elderly gentleman from Germany pointed to the signs, but she pretended not to understand. She had already decided that this trip would yield the social media photos she wanted, regardless of protocol or respect for others. The guard nearest to her position was Guardsman James Mitchell, a veteran of 2 overseas deployments who had served his country with honor for 8 years. He had stood in this exact spot dozens of times before, maintaining his composure through rain, heat, and the constant stream of tourists. He had learned to tune out the noise and focus on his duty. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his rifle held at the precise angle required by military protocol. Margaret stepped over the first barrier, her phone held high to capture what she considered the perfect angle. Other tourists gasped and began whispering among themselves. Some pulled out their own phones, sensing that something was about to happen. A mother covered her young daughter's eyes, worried about what might unfold. The atmosphere shifted from casual tourism to tense anticipation in mere seconds. Security personnel stationed around the perimeter noticed the breach immediately. They began moving toward Margaret's position, but protocol required them to assess the situation first. Was this a genuine security threat or simply an ignorant tourist? Their training taught them to never assume, to always remain vigilant. Meanwhile, Margaret continued forward, completely oblivious to the severity of her actions. She crossed the second barrier, now standing in the guard's direct pathway. This was the point of no return. Guardsman Mitchell's training kicked in automatically. His peripheral vision had already registered the intrusion, and his mind calculated the appropriate response. The rules were crystal clear. Anyone entering the guard's patrol route would receive 1 warning. After that, the guard was authorized to use necessary force to clear the obstruction. Margaret raised her phone higher, trying to get Guardsman Mitchell's face in the shot. She wanted that moment when she stood close enough to touch a royal guard, proof of her daring adventure. She imagined the likes and comments her post would receive. Her friends back home would be so jealous. She would tell them how she got closer than anyone else, how she wasn't afraid to bend a few rules for the sake of an unforgettable experience. The crowd behind the barriers grew larger as word spread that something was happening. Tourists who had been exploring other areas of the castle grounds hurried over to see what the commotion was about. Some visitors tried calling out to Margaret, warning her to step back, but their words fell on deaf ears. She was too focused on her phone screen, adjusting the angle, checking the lighting, completely absorbed in her own world. Guardsman Mitchell's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible indication that he had registered the woman's presence. His years of training and discipline prevented him from breaking his stoic demeanor, but inside, he was already running through the protocol. First, the verbal warning. If that failed, physical removal of the obstruction. The safety and security of the post came before everything else, including the feelings of entitled tourists. Margaret took another step forward, now standing less than 3 feet from the guard. She reached out her hand, intending to touch his uniform for her photo. This was the moment she had planned, the ultimate trophy shot that would make her the envy of her social circle. She had no idea that she was about to experience a lesson in respect and protocol that she would never forget. The other guards remained at their posts but were fully aware of the developing situation. They trusted Guardsman Mitchell to handle it appropriately. This wasn't the first time a tourist had crossed the line, and it wouldn't be the last. But each incident served as a powerful reminder to the watching crowds about the seriousness of the guards' duties. A tour guide standing near the barriers shook his head sadly. He had seen this scenario play out before, always with the same type of person who believed rules didn't apply to them. He knew exactly what was coming next, and part of him felt a grim satisfaction that justice was about to be served. These guards deserved respect, not to be treated as props for social media photos. Margaret's finger hovered over the camera button on her phone, ready to capture her prize. The crowd fell silent, watching with bated breath. Even the children sensed that something important was about to happen. Time seemed to slow down as Margaret leaned in closer, her expensive perfume wafting in the morning air, her designer shoes clicking on the ancient stones beneath her feet. Guardsman Mitchell took a deep breath, his chest expanding beneath his red tunic. His grip on his rifle shifted almost imperceptibly. The moment had arrived. The entitled tourist was about to learn that some institutions still maintained standards, still demanded respect, still refused to bend their rules for anyone, regardless of how special they believed themselves to be. The Royal Guards had protected these grounds for centuries, and no amount of modern entitlement would change that tradition. Guardsman Mitchell's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Make way for the Queen's Guard." The command wasn't shouted, but the authority behind it made every person in the courtyard freeze. The words carried centuries of military tradition and unwavering discipline. This wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was a lawful order from a soldier performing his sworn duty. Margaret jumped back, startled by the sudden sound. Her phone nearly slipped from her hands as she stumbled on the uneven cobblestones. For the first time since arriving at the castle, reality began to pierce through her bubble of entitlement. The look on her face shifted from confidence to confusion. She had expected the guard to remain silent, to be nothing more than a statue for her amusement. The fact that he had spoken, that he had commanded her with such authority, caught her completely off guard. But Margaret's surprise quickly transformed into indignation. How dare this man speak to her that way? She was a tourist, a visitor who had paid good money to be here. In her mind, that gave her certain privileges. She had spent thousands of dollars on this trip, and she felt entitled to more than what the average person received. Her face flushed red, and her lips pressed into a thin line of anger. Instead of stepping back behind the barriers where she belonged, Margaret planted her feet firmly on the ground. She crossed her arms over her chest, her phone still clutched in one hand. Other tourists watched in disbelief, unable to comprehend why anyone would challenge a royal guard. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping, as if nature itself held its breath to witness what would happen next. Guardsman Mitchell began his patrol march, moving forward with mechanical precision. Each step was exactly the same length, his boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. This was part of his duty, to patrol his designated route without deviation. The route had been walked by thousands of guards before him, and it would be walked by thousands after. Nothing was allowed to obstruct this sacred duty, not weather, not fatigue, and certainly not entitled tourists. Margaret stood her ground, convinced that the guard would stop or walk around her. She had seen videos online of guards maintaining their composure, and she assumed that meant they would always avoid confrontation. She didn't understand that those videos showed restraint only when tourists remained behind the barriers. Once someone crossed into the guard's patrol route, the rules changed entirely. The guard had every right and indeed the duty to clear any obstruction. The distance between them closed rapidly. Guardsman Mitchell's face remained expressionless, his eyes focused straight ahead as if Margaret didn't exist. His training had prepared him for this exact scenario. Never break stride, never deviate from the patrol route, never allow personal feelings to interfere with duty. The King's Guard served the monarchy and the nation, not the whims of disrespectful tourists. At the last possible moment, when collision seemed inevitable, Margaret's confidence finally cracked. She took a hasty step to the side, nearly tripping over her own feet in her rush to avoid being walked into. The crowd behind the barriers erupted in a mixture of gasps and nervous laughter. Some people applauded. appreciating the guard's unwavering commitment to duty. Others pulled out their phones, recording the scene to share with friends and family. Margaret's face burned with humiliation. She had been forced to move, made to look foolish in front of hundreds of strangers. Her pride wounded, she made a decision that would make everything exponentially worse. Instead of returning to the proper tourist area, instead of accepting the lesson and moving on with dignity, she decided to assert what she believed was her authority. She would show this guard and everyone watching that she was not someone to be dismissed or ignored. She rushed back into the guard's path, positioning herself directly in front of him again. This time she held up her hand in a stopping motion, as if she could simply command him to halt. Her voice rang out across the courtyard, shrill and demanding. "Excuse me? I'm trying to take a photo here. You need to stop for just 1 minute. Is that really so much to ask?" The security personnel who had been approaching now quickened their pace. This situation had escalated from ignorance to deliberate obstruction. The woman wasn't just making a mistake anymore. She was actively interfering with the guard's duty, and that could not be tolerated under any circumstances. Their hands moved toward their radios, ready to call for additional support if needed. Guardsman Mitchell repeated his command, his voice slightly louder this time. "Make way for the Queen's Guard." Still, he didn't break stride. Still, he marched forward with absolute determination. The message was clear to everyone watching except Margaret. The guard would not stop, would not slow down, would not deviate from his duty for any reason short of a genuine emergency. Margaret's eyes widened as she realized he wasn't going to stop. At the very last second, she threw herself to the side, landing awkwardly on the ground. Her expensive handbag flew from her shoulder, spilling its contents across the cobblestones. Her sunglasses skittered away, one lens cracking when it hit the ground. Her perfectly styled hair came loose from its clips. She sat there in shock, surrounded by her scattered belongings, unable to process what had just happened. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people rushed forward to help her up, driven by basic human kindness despite her behavior. Others shook their heads in judgment, feeling she had gotten exactly what she deserved. Parents used the moment as a teaching opportunity, explaining to their children why rules existed and why respecting authority was important. The younger tourists continued filming, knowing this video would go viral within hours. Guardsman Mitchell completed his march to the end of his route, executed a perfect about-face and began marching back. His expression never changed. His rhythm never faltered. To him, the incident was already over. He had followed protocol exactly as trained. The obstruction had been cleared through lawful commands. Now he would continue his duty as if nothing had happened. Because in his world of military discipline, nothing significant had happened. Margaret struggled to her feet. Her knees scraped and her dignity in tatters. Security personnel finally reached her position, and their expressions made it clear that sympathy was not forthcoming. They had watched the entire incident unfold. They had seen her deliberately ignore warnings, cross barriers, and obstruct a guard performing his duty. Now they had questions for her, and depending on her answers, this embarrassing moment might become a much more serious legal matter. One security officer, a stern woman in her 30s, helped gather Margaret's belongings while her partner, a tall man with a military bearing, began explaining the situation in no uncertain terms. Margaret was being escorted from the premises. Depending on the severity of the assessment, she might face charges for obstructing military personnel in the performance of their duty. At minimum, she would be banned from returning to any royal property for the foreseeable future. Margaret tried to protest, tried to explain that she was just taking photos, that she didn't mean any harm. But her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The evidence was clear. The witnesses were numerous. The guard's authority was absolute on these grounds. She had no defense that would hold any weight. The security office was small and austere, with bare walls and uncomfortable plastic chairs. Margaret sat across from Officer Caroline Hayes, who had 20 years of experience dealing with difficult tourists. On the table between them lay Margaret's passport, her phone, and a formal incident report that was being compiled in real time. The gravity of the situation was finally beginning to sink in, though Margaret still clung to fragments of her earlier indignation. Officer Hayes reviewed the footage from multiple security cameras positioned throughout the castle grounds. Each angle showed the same story: Margaret deliberately crossing barriers, ignoring verbal warnings from other tourists. positioning herself in the guard's patrol route, and then repeating the obstruction after being cleared once. The evidence was irrefutable. This wasn't a case of accidental ignorance. This was deliberate, repeated interference with military personnel performing their lawful duties. Margaret tried to explain herself, her voice taking on a pleading quality that hadn't been there an hour ago. She talked about how much money she had spent on this vacation, how she had dreamed of visiting Windsor Castle since childhood, how she only wanted a special photograph to remember the trip. Her words tumbled out in a desperate stream, hoping that somehow her intentions would matter more than her actions. But Officer Hayes had heard similar excuses countless times before, and they never changed the fundamental facts of what had occurred. Outside the security office, the incident had already spread across social media. 3 different tourists had captured video from different angles, and within minutes of being posted, the clips were being shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from people around the world. Some expressed support for the guard's actions, praising his professionalism and adherence to duty. Others criticized Margaret's behavior, calling her entitled and disrespectful. A few defended her, arguing that the guard could have simply walked around her. But these voices were quickly drowned out by the majority who understood the importance of military protocol. Back at the guard post, Guardsman Mitchell had been relieved by another soldier for his scheduled break. He sat in the guard's common room, drinking tea and reading a book, completely unaware that he had become an internet sensation. His fellow guards knew about the incident, of course. Word traveled quickly within the regiment, but to them it was just another day, another entitled tourist learning a valuable lesson. They dealt with such situations regularly, though most tourists learned their lesson after the first verbal warning. Staff Sergeant Robert Crawford, Mitchell's superior officer, reviewed the incident report on his computer. Everything had been handled by the book. The guard had issued proper warnings, maintained appropriate force levels, and completed his duty without deviation. There would be no disciplinary action against Mitchell. Instead, Crawford made a note to use the incident as a training example for newer guards. It perfectly illustrated how to handle obstruction without losing composure or professionalism. Meanwhile, Margaret's situation was deteriorating. Officer Hayes explained that the castle management took these incidents very seriously. The Royal Guards weren't performers or actors. They were active-duty military personnel with live ammunition in some cases, responsible for the security of one of the most important historical sites in Britain. Interfering with their duties wasn't a joke or a minor infraction. It was a criminal offense under British law, specifically the Military Act which protected service members from obstruction while performing their duties. Margaret's hands trembled as she listened. She hadn't known. She truly hadn't understood the seriousness of what she was doing. But ignorance wasn't a defense, especially when signs were clearly posted and other tourists had tried to warn her. Officer Hayes produced photographs of the numerous warning signs Margaret had passed, each one explaining in multiple languages that visitors must remain behind barriers and not interfere with the guards. Margaret had no excuse. She had simply chosen to ignore rules she found inconvenient. The questioning continued for another hour. Officer Hayes needed to establish whether this was purely a case of disrespectful behavior, or if there might be more serious concerns about Margaret's intentions. After all, people who deliberately breached security protocols could potentially be conducting reconnaissance for more sinister purposes. Margaret's social media was reviewed, her travel history examined, her background checked against various databases. Fortunately for her, everything indicated she was exactly what she appeared to be: an entitled tourist who had made a serious error in judgment. Finally, Officer Hayes laid out Margaret's options. She could accept a formal ban from all royal properties for a period of 5 years, pay a substantial fine, and sign documents acknowledging her violation of posted rules and military protocols. In exchange, no criminal charges would be filed, and she would be free to continue her vacation elsewhere in Britain. However, if she refused these terms or caused any further trouble, the matter would be turned over to local police and she would face potential criminal prosecution, which could result in deportation and a permanent ban from entering the United Kingdom. Margaret's earlier defiance had completely evaporated. She nodded numbly, agreeing to all terms without protest. The fine was painful, nearly £1,000, but it was better than criminal charges. The 5-year ban meant she wouldn't be able to visit Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, or any other royal residence during what would have been the prime years for her travel plans. But again, it was better than the alternative. She signed the documents with a shaking hand, her signature barely legible. As Margaret was escorted from the security office, she passed through the castle grounds one final time. Tourists who had witnessed her earlier confrontation pointed and whispered as she walked by. Some took photos, adding to the digital record of her humiliation. Children asked their parents what the woman had done wrong, and parents used the opportunity to reinforce lessons about following rules and respecting authority. Margaret kept her eyes down, unable to meet anyone's gaze, her face burning with shame. Back at the guard post, a new shift had begun. Guardsman Mitchell's replacement stood at attention, unaware of the morning's drama. A young family approached the barriers, their children excited to see the famous guards. The father read the posted signs aloud to his kids, explaining why it was important to stay behind the barriers and not disturb the soldiers at work. The children listened attentively, their eyes wide with understanding. They took their photos from the proper distance, waved respectfully at the guard, and left with happy memories and no incidents. This was how the vast majority of visits went. Thousands of tourists came to Windsor Castle every week, and almost all of them followed the rules without issue. They understood that they were guests at a working military installation and historical monument. They respected the guards' duties and the institution they represented. Margaret had been an outlier, someone who had let entitlement and self-importance override common sense and basic decency. The videos of Margaret's encounter continued to spread throughout the day. News outlets picked up the story, using it as an example of the broader cultural problem of tourists behaving badly at historic sites. Travel bloggers wrote articles about proper etiquette when visiting military monuments. Social media influencers who specialized in travel content used the incident to educate their followers about respecting local customs and regulations when traveling abroad. Margaret's face, captured in unflattering angles as she fell to the ground, became a cautionary tale shared millions of times across the internet. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her hotel room, scrolling through the social media posts about her incident. Reading the comments was torture, but she couldn't stop herself. People from around the world were discussing her behavior, criticizing her attitude, expressing satisfaction at her comeuppance. Some comments were cruel, crossing the line into personal attacks. Others were more measured but no less damning. A few people tried to defend her, but even those defenses felt hollow and unconvincing when confronted with the video evidence. She thought about the vacation she had planned for so long, the other castles she wouldn't be able to visit now, the historical sites that were forever off limits because of one moment of stupidity. She had wanted to feel special, to have an experience that would set her apart from other tourists. Instead, she had achieved exactly that, but not in the way she had imagined. She was special now, but as an example of what not to do, a warning tale for others. 3 days had passed since the incident at Windsor Castle. Margaret remained in London. Her vacation plans drastically altered, but her determination to salvage something from the trip still intact. She had learned to keep a much lower profile, avoiding popular tourist sites where someone might recognize her from the viral videos. Instead, she visited smaller museums and quieter parks, places where she could blend into the background and escape the judgment that seemed to follow her everywhere. But the incident at Windsor wasn't an isolated case. Across London, other entitled tourists were testing the patience of royal guards with similar results. At Buckingham Palace, a young man from Australia had climbed over a barrier to take a selfie with a guard, only to be forcefully pushed back and detained by palace security. At the Tower of London, a woman from France had touched a guard's rifle, triggering an immediate security response that resulted in her temporary detention and questioning. The guard's zero-tolerance policy was being enforced consistently, yet some tourists continued to ignore warnings. The broader issue was becoming a national conversation in Britain. Television news programs ran special segments about the rise in disrespectful tourist behavior. Historians and military experts were interviewed, explaining the historical significance of the royal guards and why their duties required such strict protocols. Former guards shared their own stories of dealing with entitled visitors, painting a picture of a problem that had been building for years but had reached a critical point with the advent of social media tourism. Social media companies found themselves at the center of the controversy. Many argued that platforms like Instagram and TikTok had created a culture where getting the perfect photo or video mattered more than respecting rules, traditions, or other people. Influencers with millions of followers posted content that often showed them bending or breaking rules at famous locations, setting a dangerous example for their impressionable audiences. The pressure to create engaging content had led some tourists to take increasingly risky and disrespectful actions. Margaret watched these news programs from her hotel room, seeing her own incident replayed alongside others. She noticed a pattern. Most of the people who clashed with royal guards were middle-aged tourists from wealthy backgrounds, people who were accustomed to getting their way and who bristled at being told no. They came from cultures where customer service meant the customer was always right, and they struggled to understand that this rule didn't apply when dealing with military personnel performing security duties. Back at Windsor Castle, the guards had noticed an unexpected positive effect from the viral videos. The number of barrier violations had actually decreased significantly in the days following Margaret's incident. Tourists who might have been tempted to get a closer photo thought twice after seeing what happened to those who tried. Parents were more vigilant about keeping their children behind the barriers. Tour guides spent extra time emphasizing the rules before groups entered guard areas. The videos had served as a powerful deterrent, a real-world consequence that resonated more than any written warning could. Guardsman Mitchell, meanwhile, had been approached by his commanding officer with unexpected news. The Ministry of Defense wanted to use footage of his handling of the Margaret incident as part of a new training video for Royal Guards. His textbook application of protocol, his unwavering composure, and his measured response made him an ideal example for new recruits. Mitchell felt uncomfortable with the attention but agreed, understanding that his actions could help prepare future guards for similar situations. The training video would be part of a broader initiative to prepare guards for the reality of modern tourism. New recruits would learn not just the traditional aspects of their role, but also how to handle the unique challenges posed by social media culture, entitled tourists, and the constant presence of cameras. They would study psychology and de-escalation techniques alongside their military training. The goal was to maintain the dignity and tradition of the Royal Guard while adapting to 21st century challenges. Margaret's story took an interesting turn when she received an unexpected email. A British journalist named Sarah Chen, who specialized in travel and cultural issues, had reached out requesting an interview. Sarah's approach was different from the harsh judgment Margaret had faced online. She wanted to explore the broader context of what had happened, to understand the American tourist's perspective, and use it to illuminate the cultural disconnects that led to such incidents. After much hesitation, Margaret agreed to the interview. They met at a quiet cafe far from major tourist areas. Sarah was professional but not unkind, and for the first time since the incident, Margaret felt like someone was actually listening rather than just judging. She opened up about her mindset that day, the pressure she had felt to make her expensive vacation worthwhile, the influence of social media on her expectations, and her genuine ignorance about the seriousness of interfering with military personnel. Sarah's article, published a week later in a major British newspaper, took a more nuanced approach than the viral videos had allowed. She didn't excuse Margaret's behavior, but she contextualized it within broader patterns of tourism, cultural differences, and the impact of social media on travel experiences. The article sparked thoughtful discussions about how different cultures view authority, the responsibility of travel companies to educate tourists, and the need for clearer communication about rules at historic sites. The response to Sarah's article was mixed. Some readers appreciated the attempt to understand rather than simply condemn. Others felt that Margaret didn't deserve a sympathetic platform, that her actions spoke for themselves regardless of her intentions or background. But the article did succeed in shifting the conversation slightly, moving it from pure mockery toward a more constructive dialogue about preventing future incidents. Tourism authorities in Britain began implementing changes based on these discussions. New signs were designed with clearer, more direct language and more prominent placement. Videos were created in multiple languages explaining the role of royal guards and the consequences of interfering with their duties. These videos were shared with travel agencies and airlines, with the hope that tourists would watch them before arriving in Britain. Some travel companies began including brief educational sessions about cultural norms and rules as part of their package tours. At Windsor Castle, a new training program was introduced for the staff who interacted with tourists. Security personnel, tour guides, and visitor services employees received enhanced training in intercultural communication and de-escalation techniques. The goal was to catch potential problems earlier, before tourists crossed barriers and created incidents. Staff members learned to identify the warning signs of someone who might cause trouble, such as repeatedly testing boundaries, ignoring verbal corrections, or displaying the kind of entitled attitude that Margaret had shown. Margaret herself was processing everything that had happened. The viral fame had been humiliating, but it had also forced her to confront aspects of her personality she had never examined before. She realized that she had gone through life expecting special treatment, believing that her money and status entitled her to bend rules that others had to follow. The Royal Guard's complete indifference to her self-importance had been a shock to her system, a stark reminder that the world didn't revolve around her desires. She began reading about the history of the Royal Guards, something she should have done before her visit. She learned about the regiment's storied military history, their service in conflicts around the world, the sacrifices made by guards throughout the centuries. She read accounts from former guards about the physical and mental demands of the role, the pride they felt in serving, and the frustration they experienced when tourists treated them as props rather than soldiers. This education came too late to prevent her mistake, but it changed her perspective fundamentally. She started to understand that her actions hadn't just been a minor breach of etiquette. She had disrespected a centuries-old military tradition, interfered with a soldier performing his duty, and demonstrated a level of cultural ignorance that was embarrassing for her as an American abroad. The shame she felt was no longer just about being caught and humiliated. It was about genuinely understanding why what she had done was wrong. 6 months after the incident, Margaret's life had changed in ways she never could have anticipated. The viral videos had gradually faded from the forefront of social media, replaced by newer scandals and controversies, but the impact on Margaret personally remained profound. She had returned to her home in Connecticut, to her comfortable suburban life, but she was not the same person who had left for that vacation. Her friends and family had seen the videos. Everyone in her social circle knew what had happened. Some had been sympathetic, offering comfort and understanding. Others had been quietly judgmental, their changed behavior subtle but noticeable. Invitations to certain social events dried up. Conversations at the country club took on a strained quality when she entered the room. Margaret had gone from being a respected member of her community to being that woman who had embarrassed herself at Windsor Castle. The experience had forced Margaret into a period of deep self-reflection. She began therapy, something she had always considered beneath her, a sign of weakness that other people needed but not her. Her therapist, Dr. Patricia Morrison, helped her explore the roots of her entitled behavior. They discussed her upbringing in a wealthy family, the way she had been sheltered from consequences throughout her life, the bubble of privilege she had lived in that made her believe normal rules didn't apply to her. Through these sessions, Margaret came to understand that her behavior at Windsor Castle was just the most visible example of a lifetime pattern. She thought about how she treated service workers, how she spoke to people she considered beneath her social station, how she had used her money and status as weapons to get her way. The Royal Guard's complete indifference to her perceived importance had shattered the illusion she had built her identity around. For the first time in her adult life, she was confronting the reality of who she had become. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the conversation about tourist behavior continued to evolve. The Ministry of Defense released statistics showing that incidents of barrier breaches and guard interference had actually decreased by 40% since the Windsor Castle video went viral. The real-world consequences captured on video had proven to be more effective than any number of warning signs or verbal cautions. Tourists were taking the rules seriously because they had seen what happened to those who didn't. However, new challenges were emerging. Some tourists, instead of being deterred, were actually seeking out confrontations with Royal Guards, hoping to create their own viral videos. These attention seekers would deliberately provoke guards, trying to get dramatic reactions that they could post online. Security personnel had to adapt their strategies to handle this new breed of troublemaker, people who weren't just ignorant or entitled, but actively seeking conflict for social media fame. Guardsman Mitchell had completed his rotation at Windsor Castle and was now stationed at the Tower of London. His life had returned to normal, the brief internet fame having no lasting impact on his military career or personal life. He rarely thought about the incident anymore. To him, it had been a routine application of protocol, nothing more. He had no idea that his actions that day had become a teaching tool, not just for military training, but for broader discussions about respect, authority, and cultural norms. The journalist Sarah Chen continued to follow the story, writing several follow-up articles about the changing nature of tourism and the responsibilities of travelers in the social media age. Her work caught the attention of travel industry leaders, and she was invited to speak at conferences about sustainable and respectful tourism. She used Margaret's story as a central case study, always being careful to focus on the lessons rather than continuing to shame the individual. Margaret had reached out to Sarah several times over the months following their first interview. A strange friendship had developed between them. Sarah appreciated Margaret's genuine efforts to grow and change, while Margaret valued having someone who knew her story, but didn't define her entirely by her worst moment. Through their conversations, Sarah gained deeper insights into the psychology of entitled behavior, understanding that it often stemmed from insecurity and a need for external validation rather than genuine malice. One day, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She volunteered to speak at a high school in her community about her experience. The school's social studies department was doing a unit on cultural awareness and international travel, and Margaret offered to share her story as a cautionary tale. Standing before an auditorium full of teenagers, many of whom had probably seen the video of her falling at Windsor Castle, Margaret did something she had never been good at. She was honest and vulnerable. She told them about her entitlement, her ignorance, and her humiliation. She explained how she had believed that having money meant she deserved special treatment. She described the shame of becoming an internet joke, the damage to her reputation, the loss of friendships. But most importantly, she talked about what she had learned. She explained that respect for other cultures, rules, and authorities wasn't optional. She emphasized that no photograph or social media post was worth compromising your integrity or disrespecting others. The students listened with surprising attentiveness. In a world where they were constantly bombarded with images of influencers breaking rules for content, having a real person stand before them and describe the consequences was powerful. During the question and answer session, several students asked thoughtful questions about cultural differences, the pressure to create perfect social media content, and how to balance wanting memorable experiences with respecting boundaries. One young girl raised her hand and asked a question that struck Margaret deeply. "Do you think the Royal Guard was too harsh? I mean, he could have just walked around you, right?" Margaret paused, understanding that this was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. She explained that the guard wasn't being harsh at all. He was doing his job, following protocols that existed for very good reasons. The harshness wasn't in his actions, but in her refusal to respect his duty. After the presentation, several teachers approached Margaret to thank her. One teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, told her that her willingness to share such a humiliating experience for the benefit of students was truly admirable. He mentioned that many of his students were planning trips abroad after graduation, and hearing her story might prevent them from making similar mistakes. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose, a feeling that maybe something positive could come from her terrible error. Word of Margaret's school presentation spread through her community. Other schools began reaching out, asking if she would be willing to speak to their students as well. Youth groups, church organizations, and community centers extended invitations. Margaret found herself becoming an unlikely advocate for respectful tourism and cultural awareness. It wasn't a role she had ever imagined for herself, but it gave meaning to her experience and helped her process the shame she still carried back in Britain. The Royal Guards continued their duties with the same professionalism they had always maintained. The viral videos from months earlier were now being used in official capacity. The British Tourist Authority incorporated clips into their promotional materials, not to shame tourists but to clearly demonstrate expectations. Airlines showed the videos during pre-flight safety presentations on routes to London. Hotels included information about proper behavior at royal sites in their welcome packets for international guests. The impact was measurable and significant. Not only had barrier breaches decreased, but the overall atmosphere at royal sites had improved. Tourists were more respectful, more mindful of the rules, and more appreciative of the privilege of visiting these historic locations. The guards reported feeling more respected in their roles. Security personnel spent less time dealing with problematic behavior and more time helping genuinely curious visitors learn about British history and tradition. Margaret's transformation caught the attention of a documentary filmmaker named James Hartford. He had been working on a project about the intersection of social media, tourism, and cultural conflicts. Margaret's journey from entitled tourist to humbled advocate for respectful travel fit perfectly into his narrative. After several conversations, Margaret agreed to participate in the documentary, seeing it as another opportunity to turn her mistake into something educational. The filming process was intense and emotional. James didn't shy away from the difficult moments, asking Margaret to watch the viral video with him and describe what she had been thinking at each moment. He interviewed her friends and family about the person she had been before the incident and the changes they had observed since. He even traveled to Britain to interview security personnel at Windsor Castle and, remarkably, secured a brief interview with Guardsman Mitchell himself. Mitchell's perspective added an important dimension to the story. He spoke with the same calm professionalism he had displayed during the incident. He explained that he had felt no anger toward Margaret that day, no personal offense. He had simply been doing his job, following the protocols he had been trained to follow. When asked if he thought the response was too harsh, Mitchell's answer was simple and direct. 1 year after the incident, Margaret stood in a conference room at a major travel industry convention in New York City. She had been invited to participate in a panel discussion about responsible tourism in the age of social media. Sitting beside her were travel bloggers, industry executives, and cultural experts. A year ago, she would have felt superior to these people, confident in her own importance. Now she felt grateful for the opportunity to contribute to an important conversation. The moderator introduced Margaret as someone who had learned about respectful tourism the hard way. There were knowing chuckles from the audience. Many of them had seen the video, but as Margaret began to speak, sharing her story with honesty and humility, the mood in the room shifted. People leaned forward in their seats, genuinely interested in what she had to say. She didn't make excuses or try to minimize what she had done. Instead, she owned her mistakes completely and discussed the lessons she had learned. She talked about the disconnect between the carefully curated images on social media and the reality of travel. She explained how the pressure to create content that would impress others had blinded her to the experience itself and to the people around her. She discussed the entitlement that came from privilege, the way money and status could insulate people from consequences, until a moment like hers shattered that protection. Her words resonated with many in the audience who recognized similar patterns in their own behavior or in the tourists they encountered. During the question period, a young travel influencer with millions of followers asked Margaret what she would say to content creators who needed to push boundaries to create engaging material. Margaret's response was firm but not judgmental. She explained that there was a difference between creative, engaging content and content that disrespected others or violated rules. True creativity, she argued, came from working within boundaries, not from breaking them. The best travel content showed authentic experiences and genuine cultural appreciation, not staged confrontations or rule-breaking for shock value. After the panel, several people approached Margaret to continue the conversation. A representative from a major airline asked if she would be interested in creating educational materials for their international passengers. A tourism board member from Britain thanked her for helping to change the conversation around visitor behavior at historic sites. A young college student planning her first trip abroad asked for advice on how to be a respectful tourist. Margaret answered each person with patience and thoughtfulness, still amazed that her worst moment had somehow led to this. The documentary that James Hartford had created premiered at a film festival to positive reviews. Critics praised its balanced approach to a controversial topic, its refusal to simply shame or condemn, and its exploration of the deeper cultural issues at play. The film was picked up by a streaming service and began reaching a global audience. Margaret watched it at home with her family, feeling vulnerable and exposed but also proud of the message it conveyed. The responses to the documentary were varied and intense. Some viewers remained critical of Margaret, feeling she didn't deserve redemption or a platform. Others were moved by her transformation and appreciated her willingness to be so publicly honest about her flaws. Many people shared their own stories of learning hard lessons about respect and cultural awareness while traveling. The film sparked conversations in schools, community groups, and online forums about what it meant to be a responsible global citizen. Guardsman Mitchell watched the documentary at the suggestion of his commanding officer. He was surprised to see how much had come from that brief interaction a year ago. He still felt no particular emotion about the incident itself, but he appreciated that something positive had emerged from it. When interviewed by a military magazine about his appearance in the film, Mitchell emphasized that he had simply been doing his duty. He hoped people understood that the Royal Guards weren't trying to be harsh or intimidating. They were professional soldiers with important responsibilities, and they needed to be able to perform those duties without interference. The changes that had begun after the viral video continued to evolve. Tourism organizations around the world started implementing similar educational initiatives, recognizing that the problem wasn't unique to Britain or to Royal Guards. Historic sites in France reported similar issues with tourists at the Palace of Versailles. Museums in Italy dealt with visitors touching priceless artwork for photos. Religious sites in Japan struggled with tourists who showed disrespect for sacred spaces. Margaret's story had become a symbol of a global challenge that required ongoing attention and education. Margaret herself had become an unexpected advocate for change. She started a blog where she shared her experiences and reflections on responsible tourism. Unlike typical travel blogs focused on destinations and experiences, hers focused on mindset and behavior. She wrote about checking your privilege, researching cultural norms before traveling, respecting local rules and traditions, and finding meaning in travel beyond social media validation. Her following grew slowly but steadily, attracting readers who were tired of the superficial content that dominated travel social media. She also began working with schools in a more organized capacity. With the help of educators and cultural experts, she developed a curriculum about global citizenship and respectful travel. The program was adopted by several school districts and youth organizations. Students learned about different cultures, the importance of rules and protocols in various settings, and how to be thoughtful ambassadors when traveling abroad. Margaret visited classrooms regularly, always willing to share her story and answer questions honestly. Her relationship with her family had improved significantly. Her husband, who had been embarrassed and frustrated by her behavior initially, now expressed pride in the work she was doing. He saw a depth in his wife that he hadn't noticed before, a willingness to be vulnerable and to grow that he found admirable. Her adult children, who had been mortified when their friends showed them the viral video, now spoke with respect about their mother's transformation. The incident had forced difficult conversations within the family about values, privilege, and personal responsibility. Margaret's friendships had also evolved. Some relationships hadn't survived the incident and its aftermath. People she had considered close friends had drifted away, unable or unwilling to see past her public humiliation. But new friendships had formed with people who appreciated her honesty and her efforts to make amends. These new relationships felt more authentic to Margaret, based on mutual respect and genuine connection, rather than social status and convenience. On the anniversary of the incident, Margaret did something she had been planning for months. She wrote a formal letter of apology to the British Ministry of Defence, specifically to the regiment that Guardsman Mitchell served in. In the letter, she acknowledged the disrespect she had shown to a soldier performing his duty. She thanked the guard for his professionalism and for inadvertently teaching her a lesson she desperately needed to learn. She expressed her hope that the positive changes that had emerged from the incident would honor the tradition and service of the Royal Guards. The ministry responded with a gracious letter, acknowledging her apology and commending her efforts to promote respectful tourism. They mentioned that they had been following her work and appreciated her willingness to turn a negative incident into something educational and positive. The letter concluded by stating that while her ban from royal properties remained in effect as per the original agreement, they recognized and valued the personal growth she had demonstrated. Margaret framed this letter and hung it in her home office, a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she still had to go. Personal growth, she had learned, wasn't a destination but an ongoing journey. There would always be more to learn, more ways to improve, more opportunities to show respect and humility. The entitled tourist who had crossed those barriers at Windsor Castle was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true privilege came not from money or status, but from the opportunity to learn, grow, and contribute positively to the world. The Royal Guards continued their duties as they had for centuries, standing watch over Britain's most treasured historic sites. They remained vigilant, professional, and unwavering in their commitment to duty. The viral videos and increased public awareness had made their job somewhat easier, but challenges remained. There would always be tourists who tested boundaries, who believed rules didn't apply to them, who prioritized their own desires over respect for others. But the guards were ready, trained, and prepared to handle whatever came their way with the same professionalism that Guardsman Mitchell had displayed that day at Windsor Castle. The story of Margaret and the Royal Guard became more than just a viral moment. It became a teaching tool, a conversation starter, and a symbol of both the problems facing modern tourism and the potential for personal transformation. Schools showed the video in citizenship classes. Tourism companies used it in training materials. Parents referenced it when teaching children about consequences and respect. The brief confrontation on those ancient cobblestones had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted.